Nathan Reed methodically carved the 20-pound turkey, his movements precise and controlled as a surgeon's. Each slice fell perfectly onto the platter, arranged in a way that would make any food magazine editor proud. The kitchen of his colonial Vermont home buzzed with the sounds of preparation. Timers beeping, pots simmering, and the distant murmur of conversation from the dining room. "Regina, honey, could you grab the serving tongs from the drawer?" Nathan called out to his wife, who was arranging flowers in the adjacent dining room. The scent of sage and rosemary wafted through the air, mixing with the aroma of freshly baked rolls and apple pie. Regina's voice carried a musical lilt that still caught attention even after 17 years of marriage. At 42, she remained striking, elegant curves and practiced grace. She breezed into the kitchen, her designer dress perfectly pressed, not a strand of honey blonde hair out of place. Nathan observed her fluid movements as she retrieved the tongs. Everything about Regina was carefully curated, from her French manicure to her subtle designer perfume. She'd been particularly meticulous today, even by her standards. "You've outdone yourself this year, Regina," she said, running her hand across his shoulder blades as she passed behind him. "The cranberry sauce is divine. I snuck a taste earlier." "Family recipe," Nathan replied, pride evident in his voice. "Grandmother Reed would have my head if I used the canned stuff." At 45, he'd mastered every detail of these gatherings, turning them into an art form. His restaurants might have made him wealthy, but these intimate family moments were his true masterpieces. The kitchen doors swung open, and Thomas Reed stumbled in, clutching an empty wine glass. Nathan's younger brother had always been the family's loose cannon, but today he seemed determined to push boundaries. His cheeks were flushed, his expensive shirt already sporting a red wine stain. "Need any help, big brother?" Thomas' words slurred together as he gripped the edge of the granite counter for stability. Nathan's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I've got it under control, Thomas. Maybe you should slow down on the Cabernet. That's the 82-year drinking." Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "It's Thanksgiving. Live a little, Nathan. You always were the responsible one." He attempted to straighten himself, nearly knocking over a bowl of garnish. "Remember when we were kids? You'd always cover for me with Dad." "That was a long time ago," Nathan replied, his tone measured. He continued arranging the turkey, each movement deliberate and focused. The knife in his hand caught the light as he made another precise cut. Regina intervened smoothly, taking Thomas' arm. "Why don't I show you the renovations we did in the living room? The new artwork just arrived from Paris." She guided Thomas away from the kitchen, throwing Nathan a knowing look over her shoulder. Nathan watched them go, noting how his wife's hand lingered on Thomas' arm slightly longer than necessary. In another life, before the restaurants, before his comfortable civilian existence, such details had been his stock in trade. 8 years in military intelligence had taught him the value of observation. The sounds of arriving family members filtered through from the front of the house. Nathan heard his cousin Sarah's distinctive laugh, followed by the deeper tones of her husband Mark. Their children's excited voices joined the growing chorus of conversation. "Uncle Nathan." His niece Emily burst into the kitchen, her face bright with excitement. "Can I help? Mom says I'm getting really good at cooking." Nathan's expression softened. "Of course, sweetheart. Want to help me arrange these garnishes?" He handed her a sprig of fresh parsley, showing her how to place it just so. More family members began filtering into the kitchen, drawn by the aromas and warmth. Aunt Patricia immediately began critiquing his technique. "You're carving at too sharp an angle, dear," while Uncle George hovered near the wine rack, eyeing the selections. Regina reappeared, now in full hostess mode. She moved through the gathering crowd with practiced ease, refilling glasses and directing traffic. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she announced. "Why don't we all move to the dining room? Nathan's prepared something special this year." Nathan noticed her slight tension, masked beneath layers of social polish. 17 years of marriage had taught him to read the subtle signs. The way she touched her neck more frequently than usual, her laugh pitching slightly higher than normal. The dining room table was a testament to Regina's eye for detail. Fine china gleamed under the chandelier's light, each place setting perfectly arranged. Name cards and elegant calligraphy guided guests to their seats. Strategic placement designed to maximize conversation and minimize potential conflicts. "The table looks beautiful," Sarah commented, running her hand along the pristine tablecloth. "Regina, you always make everything look so effortless." Regina beamed. "Thank you, darling. Though I can't take all the credit. Nathan's the real artist here." She gestured toward the kitchen, where he was finishing the final preparations. Thomas had found his way back to the wine cabinet, now working on another glass of the expensive Cabernet. "Remember those summer camping trips we used to take?" he called out, his voice carrying above the general conversation. "Up at Lake Champlain. Those were the days, weren't they?" Regina paused in her work, noting the momentary freeze in Regina's movements before she recovered. "Ancient history," she replied lightly, turning to adjust an already perfect place setting. The guests began taking their seats, the room filling with the comfortable chaos of a family gathering. Nathan emerged from the kitchen carrying the turkey platter, every slice artfully arranged. He'd learned long ago that presentation was as important as taste in restaurants and in life. "Before we begin," Nathan addressed the gathered family, standing at the head of the table, "I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Family traditions like these, they're what make life meaningful." Regina raised her wine glass. "To family," she offered, her voice steady, but her fingers gripping the stem slightly too tightly. "To family," the group echoed, unaware of the currents running beneath the perfect surface of the gathering. Nathan took his seat, unfolding his napkin with deliberate care. He'd spent decades perfecting this image. The successful restaurateur, the generous host, the devoted husband. Only those who knew him in his previous life might recognize the steel beneath the polished exterior. As the dishes began circulating, Nathan observed the dynamics around his table. Thomas, increasingly unsteady, kept throwing knowing glances at Regina. Mark and Steve, Nathan's longtime friends, seemed unusually interested in their plates, avoiding eye contact. And Regina, his perfect wife, maintained her hostess smile while her eyes darted between Thomas and the other men with growing frequency. The meal progressed, each course timed and presented with professional precision. Nathan carved additional turkey as needed, his handling of the knife drawing appreciative comments from the guests. If anyone noticed that his grip on the handle was slightly tighter than necessary, they didn't mention it. "Remember that time at the lake when Regina got lost in the woods? You were so worried, searching everywhere," Thomas called out, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "Perhaps we should focus on the present," Regina interjected smoothly. "Sarah, how is the new house coming along?" Nathan noted the interaction without comment, filing it away with other observations from the evening. Years of training had taught him the value of patience, of letting events unfold naturally. He'd learned that the most devastating strikes were the ones the target never saw coming. The conversation moved on, flowing around the table like wine into empty glasses. But beneath the surface of familial warmth, tension simmered. Nathan continued his role as the gracious host, all while cataloging every glance, every nervous movement, every subtle sign that something was very wrong with this perfect picture. As Nathan began serving the pumpkin pie, each slice perfectly proportioned and topped with fresh whipped cream, he noticed Thomas fumbling with his phone under the table. His brother's face wore an expression Nathan recognized from their childhood. The same look Thomas had before setting fire to their father's shed or taking the car for a joyride. "Everything good there, Thomas?" Nathan asked, his voice carrying just enough edge to make several heads turn. Thomas pushed back his chair, swaying as he stood. "Actually, big brother." Thomas' words slurred, but his eyes remained sharp. "I've got something to share with everyone." He held up his phone, grinning with malicious intent, a little walk down memory lane. Regina's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Nathan noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the table. "Those camping trips we used to take up to Lake Champlain." Thomas continued, his voice carrying a cruel note of triumph. "You remember them, don't you, Regina? All those midnight walks in the woods." The room's atmosphere shifted, tension replacing the earlier warmth. Nathan remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his mind racing through scenarios, analyzing threats and responses as he'd been trained to do. "Thomas, you're drunk," Regina said, her voice steady but her face pale. "Perhaps we should call you a car." "Oh, I'm drunk, all right," Thomas laughed. "But that doesn't make this any less true." He pressed play on his phone, turning the screen toward the gathered family members. The video quality was poor, shot in low light, but the content was unmistakable. Regina, younger but clearly recognizable, giggling as she crawled into a tent. The timestamp showed August 2019. The footage continued, showing her emerging from one tent and moving to another, then another. "Your perfect wife wasn't lost in the woods that night." Thomas' voice dripped with satisfaction. "She was keeping herself quite busy. Weren't you, Regina? Want to tell everyone about your visits to my tent? And Steve's. And Mark's." The silence that followed was absolute. Nathan looked at his wife, noting how she sat perfectly straight, her chin lifted in defiance rather than lowered in shame. It was the reaction of someone used to fighting back, not someone caught in a momentary indiscretion. Steve and Mark stared at their plates, their wives rigid beside them. Sarah covered her children's ears, while Aunt Patricia pressed a hand to her mouth in shock. "You want to play this game, Thomas?" Regina's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Fine. Let's talk about what you've been doing with Dad's company money. The offshore accounts, the fake vendors, all those mysterious consulting fees." Nathan watched the color drain from Thomas' face. His wife wasn't denying the accusations. She was counterattacking, using information she shouldn't have had access to. The implications spun through his mind, pieces falling into place with military precision. "Regina," Nathan spoke for the first time since the video played, his voice quiet but carrying authority that made everyone turn toward him. "How exactly do you know about Thomas' financial dealings?" She faltered for a moment, her perfect mask slipping. I heard things. People talk. They certainly do." Nathan agreed, his tone conversational but his eyes cold. "Just like they talk about midnight visits to tents, apparently." The room erupted into chaos. Aunt Patricia began gathering her belongings, muttering about propriety. Sarah hurried her children toward the door, throwing disappointed glances at her husband, Mark. Steve's wife burst into tears while Thomas stood swaying. His moment of triumph turned to ash. "Nathan." Regina reached for his hand across the table, but he withdrew it smoothly, as if adjusting his napkin. "We should discuss this privately." "Oh, I think we're well past privacy," Nathan replied. His restaurant owner smile was still in place, but now carrying an edge that made several guests step back. "Though I am curious about one thing." He turned to Thomas, who flinched under his gaze. "Why show the video now, little brother? After all these years?" Thomas' bravado crumbled. She was threatening me. About the company accounts. I had to." "Had to what?" Nathan's voice remained calm, reasonable, even as his eyes promised consequences. "Had to destroy our family's Thanksgiving. Had to reveal your own misdeeds in the process." Regina stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. Thomas is drunk. The video could be anyone. And these accusations about financial impropriety are absurd. Interesting that you jumped to defend the financial accusations rather than your own fidelity," Nathan observed, causing Regina to falter mid-stride. The room began to empty quickly, guests making hurried excuses as they fled the imploding celebration. Plates of half-eaten pumpkin pie sat abandoned, whipped cream melting into sad puddles. Thomas made a clumsy grab for his phone, but Nathan's hand shot out with surprising speed, catching his brother's wrist. "I think I'll hold on to that for now," he said quietly, taking the device. "Evidence and all that." "You can't. That's my personal property," Thomas protested weakly. "Consider it payment for the wine you've consumed." Nathan's grip tightened until Thomas winced. "The 82 Cabernet alone is worth more than your phone." Regina watched this exchange, calculation replacing defiance in her expression. "Nathan, darling, you're upset. We should talk about this rationally. Just the two of us." "Rational discussion." Nathan's laugh carried no humor. "Like the rational discussion you had with my brother about his misdeeds, or the rational discussions you had in those tents." The remaining guests took this as their cue to leave, practically running for the door. Soon only Nathan, Regina, and Thomas remained in the dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of their perfect family gathering. "You don't understand," Regina began. But Nathan held up a hand, silencing her. "Oh, I understand perfectly." His voice carried the same tone he used when dealing with problematic suppliers or health inspectors. "I understand that my wife and my brother have been playing a very dangerous game. The only question is," he smiled, causing both Regina and Thomas to step back, "are you ready for the consequences?" Regina's facade cracked completely. "Is that a threat?" "A threat?" Nathan's laugh was genuine this time, but it carried no warmth. "Regina, my dear, if I were threatening you, you wouldn't have to ask." He stood, straightening his suit jacket with precise movements. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some calls to make." He left them standing in the dining room, their faces showing the first real fear of the evening. As he walked to his study, Nathan's mind was already racing through scenarios, analyzing weaknesses, planning moves, and countermoves. The skills he'd learned in military intelligence hadn't faded. They'd just been dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The perfect host, the successful restaurateur, the deceived husband. These were roles he'd played well. But now it was time to remind everyone who he really was, what he was capable of when he crossed. The game had begun, and Nathan Reed never played to lose. Nathan sat in his study, the room illuminated by the soft glow of his laptop screen. An untouched glass of 30-year-old Macallan rested on his desk, its amber depths reflecting the digital display. The house had emptied quickly after the confrontation, leaving behind a wreckage of half-eaten desserts and shattered pretenses. The security feeds on his secondary monitor showed Regina pacing in their bedroom, phone pressed to her ear as she held intense conversations with unseen confidence. Her perfect composure had cracked, revealing the calculating survivor beneath. In the guest room, Thomas had passed out, his drunken bravado replaced by alcohol-induced oblivion. Nathan's fingers moved across the keyboard with military precision, each keystroke purposeful. Multiple screens of financial data filled his display: banking records, property transfers, corporate filings. His restaurant empire had given him access to financial tools and connections that would make any investigator envious. 8 years in military intelligence, he muttered to himself, pulling up another database. "Did you really think I wouldn't have contingencies, Regina?" His phone buzzed. A message from Detective James Morrison. "Got your message. This is bigger than you know. Meet tomorrow, 700, usual place. Bring everything you have on Thomas's financials." Nathan allowed himself a small smile. James had been his closest ally during his military days, and their friendship had only strengthened since both returning to civilian life. While Nathan built restaurants, James had risen through the ranks of local law enforcement, maintaining connections with federal agencies that would prove invaluable. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his work. "Nathan." Regina's voice carried a practiced note of vulnerability. "Can we talk about this?" "Come in," Nathan replied, his tone perfectly neutral as he minimized several windows. "I assume you finished your phone calls." She entered, her designer dress slightly wrinkled now. Her perfect makeup showed signs of wear. "Those calls were nothing. Just canceling our weekend plans with the Hironsons after today's unpleasantness." "Interesting," Nathan said, taking a sip of his scotch. From the security feed, it looked rather intense for a simple cancellation. Regina froze, her eyes darting to the monitors. "You've been watching me." "Oh, I've been watching everyone, dear. It's amazing what modern security systems can do. The cameras, the audio feeds, one might even say they're military grade. This isn't like you." Regina attempted to recover. All this suspicion, these accusations, the Nathan I married, the Nathan you married. He cut her off smoothly. Was exactly who I am. You just never bothered to look beyond the surface. He turned his laptop screen toward her, showing a complex web of financial transactions. "Tell me, when did you first start helping Thomas hide money?" "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her hand moving unconsciously to her neck. "I tell you, Nathan," he had noted years ago. "No," she insisted. He pulled up another screen. "So these transfers from our joint account to a shell company in the Caymans, that wasn't you. The same shell company that's been paying consulting fees to Thomas's offshore accounts." Regina's composure cracked further. "You can't prove anything." "Actually," Nathan smiled, pressing a key that started a printer humming in the corner. "I can prove everything. Would you like to see the documentation? I have copies for your lawyer." Her laugh held a note of hysteria. "Nathan, we can work this out. What happened at the lake, it was years ago. A mistake. And the money. There are explanations." Nathan stood, his movement deliberately slow. Regina, you still think this is a negotiation that you can manipulate the situation like you've done so many times before?" He walked to the printer, collecting the still warm pages. "But you made one crucial mistake." "And what's that?" she asked, backing toward the door. "You betrayed someone trained to protect the family," he replied calmly. "Did you really think I'd be less effective against those who wronged me?" Regina's face drained of color. "What are you going to do?" "Me?" Nathan returned to his desk, arranging the printed documents with meticulous care. "I'm going to finish my scotch, review these financial records, and get a good night's sleep. But you," he looked up, his eyes cold, "should probably start packing." "You can't just throw me out," she protested. "Half of everything is mine." Nathan's laugh held no humor. "Check the print-up again, specifically sections 12 through 15. The ones your lawyer assured you were standard boilerplate about infidelity and criminal conduct. I helped write those clauses, Regina. They're anything but standard." Her hand trembled as she grabbed the doorframe for support. "I'll fight this. I have evidence on you too. Financial misdeeds at the restaurants, cash deals under the table." "By all means," Nathan gestured to the door. "Try. But remember, you're not dealing with just a restaurant anymore. I've had years to prepare for this moment." Regina fled the study, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Nathan returned to his laptop, pulling up a secure messaging system he hadn't used since his military days. Within minutes, he had mapped out every account his brother had touched in the past decade, every property Regina had visited in the last 5 years, and every secret his wife and former friends thought safely buried. His phone buzzed again, another message from James. "FBI's interested. Treasury too. How deep do you want to go?" Nathan typed a single word in response. "Everything." The house creaked and settled around him as night deepened. From upstairs came the sounds of Regina's movement. Drawers opening, closet doors sliding. Nathan paid no attention. Instead, he focused on his screens, building his case with the same attention to detail he'd once used to track international threats. The night stretched ahead, filled with possibilities and preparations. Nathan had learned long ago that timing was everything, whether in military operations or in the kitchen. Every ingredient needed to be perfectly measured, every step precisely executed. As he continued working, Regina's earlier words echoed in his mind. "The Nathan I married." She'd never finished that sentence. Soon enough, she'd understand exactly who she'd married. The screen before him filled with data, each piece a weapon more potent than any he'd wielded in his military days. In the kitchen, he executed recipes with surgical precision. In his study, he would execute justice with the same exactitude. The month following Thanksgiving unfolded like a meticulously orchestrated operation. Nathan maintained his daily routines with military precision, opening restaurants, reviewing menus, attending business meetings. To the outside world, he appeared exactly as Regina expected, a successful but devastated husband struggling to process betrayal. "Nathan, darling." Regina's voice carried artificial sweetness as she entered his home office one morning. "I've been talking with my lawyer. We should discuss the settlement terms." Nathan looked up from his laptop, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" Regina placed a document on his desk, manicured nail tapping specific paragraphs. "Given my contributions to the business over the years, my legal team suggests a 60-40 split would be fair. In my favor, naturally." "Naturally," Nathan replied, not bothering to look at the paper. Instead, he opened his email, clicking send on a message he'd prepared hours earlier. Regina's phone buzzed immediately. Her confident smile faltered as she read the notification. "What? What is this about the SEC investigating Thomas?" "Oh, that." Nathan's tone remained conversational. "Anonymous tip, apparently something about irregular financial transactions and offshore accounts. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Regina's composure cracked slightly. "This is about Thanksgiving, isn't it?" "Nathan, that video was years ago. A mistake. We should focus on moving forward amicably." "Amicably?" Nathan tested the word. "Like how you amicably helped my brother mismanage money from my restaurants, or how you amicably planned to take 60% of what I built." Regina's phone buzzed again. Her face paled as she read each message. "Steve's company. There must be some mistake. And Mark's financial issues. How did these become public?" "The truth has a way of surfacing," Nathan observed, turning back to his laptop. "Sometimes it just needs a little encouragement." Over the next weeks, Nathan watched Regina's carefully constructed world crumble. Each morning brought new revelations. Steve's company faced a comprehensive audit. Mark's creditors suddenly became extremely interested in collecting. Thomas received formal notice of a criminal investigation. "You seem distracted," Nathan commented one evening, finding Regina frantically typing on her phone. "Worried about something?" She forced a smile, but her hands trembled slightly. "Just work stress, darling. Though since you mention it, I've been thinking about the lake house. I really think I should have it in the settlement." Nathan's laugh held no humor. "The lake house? My grandfather's property that you've never visited. Interesting choice. I need somewhere to reflect, to start fresh." Regina's voice carried a note of desperation. "After everything we've shared." "Everything we've shared." Nathan cut her off. "Like how you shared your evenings with my brother and my friends." Regina's mask slipped completely. "Is that what this is about? Revenge? I never thought you'd be so petty." "Petty?" Nathan's smile made her step back. "Regina, if I were being petty, I'd have simply divorced you. Instead, I'm going to teach you and everyone else what happens to those who mistake kindness for weakness." He turned his laptop screen toward her. Surveillance photos filled the display. Regina meeting with Thomas at various locations, exchanging documents, making suspicious transfers at ATMs. "How did you?" she started. 8 years in military intelligence wasn't just a line on my resume," Nathan replied. "While you thought I was earning my fortune in restaurants, I was tracking unauthorized activities and dismantling enemy networks. Tell me, which skill set do you think is more useful for dealing with betrayal?" Regina grabbed her phone, fingers shaking as she tried to make a call. "This stops now. I'm calling my lawyer." "By all means," Nathan gestured to the door. "Though you might want to warn him, the SEC is very interested in your recent wire transfers to certain offshore accounts. The same accounts Thomas used coincidentally." Regina fled the room, her heels clicking rapidly down the hallway. Nathan returned to his work, forwarding another batch of damning evidence to federal investigators. Each move was calculated, each revelation timed for maximum impact. His phone buzzed. A message from Detective Morrison. Steve's company board called an emergency meeting. They found the evidence you provided. Nathan smiled. The pieces were falling exactly as planned. He learned in the military that the most effective strategy wasn't to destroy your enemies directly. It was to let them destroy themselves. Regina's desperation peaked 2 weeks later. Nathan's surveillance team tracked her to a dive bar outside town, where she met Thomas in what they thought was a secure location. Meaver suspected that the bartender, a former Navy SEAL who'd served with Nathan, was recording every word. "He knows something," Regina hissed, clutching her vodka tonic. "Everything's falling apart. The SEC investigation, Steve's scandal, Mark's debts going public. It's all connected." Thomas strained his whiskey, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. "Impossible. Nathan's just a chef who got lucky. He doesn't have the skills or connections for this." "Then who?" Regina's voice rose sharply before she caught herself. "The timing's too perfect. The SEC investigation started right after Thanksgiving. Steve's board finding those documents. Mark's creditors suddenly getting aggressive. Someone's orchestrating this." "Maybe," Thomas conceded, ordering another drink. "But Nathan, the guy who spends his days taste-testing sauces and planning wine pairings. He's not capable of this level of whatever this is." Regina leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We need to strike first. I've got evidence on him too. Financial misdeeds at the restaurants, cash deals under the table. If we move quickly, those violations were resolved years ago." A quiet voice interrupted. They turned to find the bartender, Jake Miller, standing nearby. "And the cash deals, all properly documented and reported to the IRS." "How would you know?" Thomas demanded. Jake smiled, the expression reminiscent of Nathan's calculating grin. "Because I helped set up the compliance systems. Former military intelligence tends to stick together." Regina and Thomas stared at the bartender, recognition and fear dawning in their eyes. Before they could respond, their phones buzzed simultaneously. Breaking news alerts showed Steve's company stock plummeting amid allegations of widespread fraud. "You should check on your friend," Jake suggested, polishing a glass with deliberate care. "Though I hear he's not taking calls at the moment. Something about cooperating with federal investigators." Regina grabbed her purse, practically running for the door. Thomas followed unsteadily, nearly tripping over his own feet. Jake pulled out his phone, sending a quick message. "Package delivered. Targets rattled. Moving to phase 2. Across town, Nathan received the message while reviewing security footage from his restaurants. He'd spent years building his cover as a successful restaurateur, letting everyone believe his military experience was just an interesting background detail. His phone rang. Mark, sounding desperate. "Nathan, you have to help me. The Gaming Commission, the IRS, they're asking questions I can't answer." "Interesting timing," Nathan replied coolly. "Right after my wife and brother meet to discuss their plans against me." "Tell me, Mark, did you enjoy that night at Lake Champlain?" The line went silent for a moment. How do you know about their meeting?" "I know everything." Nathan's voice carried absolute certainty. "Every transfer, every secret meeting, every attempt to hide the evidence. Did you really think I wouldn't have contingencies in place? That I'd let people into my life without knowing exactly who they were?" "We can make a deal," Mark pleaded. "I have information." "You had your chance for a deal." Nathan cut him off. 5 years ago, when you chose loyalty to Thomas over loyalty to me. Remember that choice, Mark. You're about to learn its cost." He ended the call, turning back to his monitors. Regina and Thomas had separated, each heading to their respective homes. Both would find unpleasant surprises waiting. Federal agents for Thomas, divorce papers for Regina. The next phase was ready. Nathan had learned in the military that the key to victory wasn't just attacking your enemies, it was removing their ability to fight back. Nathan chose a rainy Tuesday for the final act of his orchestrated destruction. The emergency board meeting of his restaurant group brought all the players together. Regina as a major stakeholder, Thomas hoping to protect his interests, Steve and Mark clutching their manufactured evidence of Nathan's supposed misconduct. The conference room at headquarters practically vibrated with nervous energy. Regina sat rigidly in her designer suit, while Thomas attempted to project confidence despite his obvious anxiety. Steve kept checking his phone, likely watching his company stock continue its free fall. Mark's hands trembled as he arranged papers before him. "Thank you all for coming," Nathan began, his tone professionally pleasant. "I understand you have some concerns about the company's operations." Regina saw the opportunity, launching into their prepared attack. The board needs to know about the financial irregularities, the unreported cash transactions. Before she could finish, federal agents streamed in, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Nathan's smile remained unchanged as Thomas attempted to bolt, only to find more agents blocking the exit. "Thomas," the lead agent announced, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion." He turned to Steve and Mark. "Gentlemen, we have some questions about your financial dealings as well." Regina stood to flee but found her path blocked. "Mrs. Reed," a stern-faced agent said, "we need to discuss your involvement in several financial transactions." "What is this?" she demanded, turning to Nathan. "I simply provided federal authorities with evidence of criminal activity," Nathan replied. "Isn't that what any responsible citizen would do?" He walked to the conference room's display screen, clicking through slides of meticulously documented financial crimes, wire transfers to offshore accounts, falsified invoices, embezzlement through shell companies, and, of course, the money stolen from my restaurants. Every penny you funneled to Thomas's schemes. Regina's face contorted with rage and fear. "You can't prove anything." "Actually," Nathan smiled, sliding a thick folder across the table, "I can prove everything. This is just a copy, of course. The originals are already with the relevant authorities." Thomas was already in handcuffs, his earlier bravado replaced by shocked silence. Steve and Mark sat frozen, watching years of careful deception unravel in minutes. "You planned this," Regina accused, her voice shaking. "All of it, the investigations, the revelations, everything planned." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "I simply allowed the truth to emerge. Though I must admit, my military intelligence training did come in handy. You'd be amazed what people reveal when they think no one's watching." He walked to the window, surveying the empire he'd built. "You all made the same mistake. You thought you knew who I was, the successful restaurateur, the trusting husband, the knave brother. You never wondered why a former military intelligence officer would be content running restaurants." Regina laughed bitterly as agents began reading her rights. "All this because of what happened at Lake Champlain." "No." Nathan's voice carried absolute finality. "This is because you betrayed me. The Lake Champlain video just showed me who you really were. Everything since then has been education, teaching you and anyone else who might consider crossing me the price of betrayal." He turned back to the room, watching his federal agents let his former friends and family away. Each one had played their part perfectly, never realizing they were actors in a drama he'd scripted from the moment Thomas showed that video. The lead agent approached with paperwork requiring his signature. "Impressive work, Mr. Reed. You could have had quite a career in federal law enforcement." "Perhaps," Nathan replied, signing where indicated. "But I prefer restaurants. They're much better for observing human nature." As the room emptied, Nathan sat at the head of the conference table, finally allowing himself to savor the moment. In the military, he'd learned that true victory wasn't just about defeating your enemies. It was about ensuring they never recovered enough to threaten you again. His phone buzzed one final time. A message from Jake at the bar. "Phase complete. Targets neutralized. Collateral damage minimal." Nathan smiled. Phase complete indeed. But this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of their true punishment. They would have years in prison to contemplate their mistakes, to understand exactly who they'd betrayed. The restaurant empire would continue to grow. His reputation would remain untarnished. And anyone who learned of today's events would understand the fundamental truth about Nathan Reed. He was not a man who forgave betrayal. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as the clerk read the verdict. In the case of United States versus Thomas Reed, on the count of criminal fraud, the jury finds the defendant guilty. On the count of embezzlement, the jury finds the defendant guilty. Nathan sat in the gallery, expression neutral as the litany of guilty verdicts continued. Thomas stood at the defense table, shoulders slumped, his expensive suit now ill-fitting after months in custody. The evidence had been overwhelming. Every transaction documented, every fake vendor exposed, every offshore account traced. The defendant will rise for sentencing, Judge Marshall intoned. Thomas's lawyer placed a steady hand on his arm as he stood. Your Honor, before sentencing, my client wishes to make a statement. Very well, the judge nodded. Mr. Reed, you may address the court. Thomas turned, his eyes seeking Nathan in the gallery. Brother, I know what I did was wrong. The embezzlement, the fraud. But exposing Regina that night was about protecting you. You deserve to know. Mr. Reed, Judge Marshall interrupted, addressing the court, not the gallery. 15 years, the judge pronounced minutes later. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $12 million. As federal marshals led Thomas away, Nathan remained seated, reviewing notes on his tablet. Steve and Mark's cases were next, their plea deals already arranged. His phone displayed updates about Regina's upcoming trial, her attempts to hide assets already thwarted by his meticulous documentation. Quite a performance, Detective Morrison commented, sliding into the seat beside Nathan. Thomas actually seemed to think his concerned brother act might work. He always did overestimate his acting abilities. Nathan replied, not looking up from his tablet. How's the SEC investigation into Steve's board members progressing? 3 more arrests this morning. The evidence you provided opened up a whole network of fraud. Morrison studied his friend's profile. You know, we could have stopped with Thomas. Steve and Mark took plea deals. Even Regina is about to lose everything. Nathan finished, as she should, as they all should. He finally looked up, his eyes cold. Did you know she tried to access my grandfather's lake house last week? Thought she could remove evidence before the asset freeze. Did she find anything? Oh yes, Nathan's smile was predatory. Every document I wanted federal agents to discover. She did half their job for them. The courthouse corridor filled with reporters as they exited, cameras flashing. Nathan moved through them with practiced ease, offering no comment. His reputation had emerged untouched, the successful restaurateur whose trust had been betrayed, who had cooperated fully with authorities. Regina's trial began the following week. Nathan attended each day, watching his wife's carefully constructed facade crumble under the weight of evidence. Her lawyer's attempts to paint her as an unwitting accomplice fell apart as Nathan's documentation revealed her central role in the schemes. Mrs. Reed, the prosecutor displayed a series of transfers on the courtroom screen. Please explain these payments from restaurant accounts to shell companies controlled by your brother-in-law. Regina's composure slipped. Those were legitimate business expenses. Really? Because we have documentation showing you personally created these shell companies. Here's the incorporation paperwork with your signature. Here are emails discussing how to disguise the transfers. Each day brought new revelations. Nathan had prepared his case meticulously, revealing evidence piece by piece. Regina's interior design business collapsed as clients fled. Her charity board positions evaporated. Social invitations disappeared. The defendant will rise, Judge Marshall commanded at Regina's sentencing. The same judge who had sentenced Thomas now turned his attention to Nathan's wife. Mrs. Reed, Your actions demonstrate a pattern of calculated deception spanning years. The court sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison. Nathan watched Regina's elegance finally shatter as Marshall approached with handcuffs. She turned to him, desperation replacing her usual confidence. "Nathan, please. We can still." "Still what?" he asked quietly. "Still pretend you didn't betray me. Still act like you didn't help steal millions from my companies. Or perhaps you'd like to discuss that night at Lake Champlain again." Tears streaked her makeup as Marshall led her away. Nathan remained in his seat, reviewing his next appointments. The following day would bring meetings with bankruptcy trustees handling Steve's assets, then updates on the international search for Mark's hidden accounts. His phone buzzed, an update from his security team. They prevented another attempt by Regina's relatives to remove items from their house. The prenup had been explicit. Infidelity and criminal conduct meant she forfeited everything. "Mr. Reed," a young prosecutor approached, files clutched to her chest. "I just wanted to thank you. Your evidence made these cases airtight." Nathan nodded politely. "Justice should be thorough. Wouldn't you agree? Speaking of which, I have some additional documentation you might find interesting. It concerns Regina's involvement in certain overseas transactions." Nathan's restaurants thrived in the months following the trials. He expanded aggressively, acquiring properties from his former friends, bankrupted enterprises. Each location was renovated, reimagined, and reopened to spectacular success. Table 7 sent compliments to the chef. His manager reported one evening at the flagship location. "They're particularly impressed with the new sous chef, James." Nathan glanced toward the kitchen. "Yes, he's proving quite talented. Remind me, how long has he been out of custody?" 6 months. He was part of that investment fraud ring last year. Nathan nodded, satisfied. His practice of hiring reformed convicts had generated considerable positive press. No one connected these acts of mercy with his systematic destruction of those who had betrayed him. The public saw only a successful businessman giving second chances. "Your usual table is ready, sir," the hostess informed him as Detective Morrison arrived for their weekly dinner. They settled into a private booth, Morrison examining the wine list. "Interesting choice, hiring Steve's former accountant as your new controller." "Sarah's excellent with numbers," Nathan replied. "And having admitted her role in the fraud, she understands the importance of absolute loyalty." Speaking of loyalty, Morrison set down his menu. "Mark's been spotted in Buenos Aires. Local authorities are monitoring his movements. No need to pursue him further." Nathan waved his hand dismissively. "His funds are frozen, his reputation destroyed. Let him hide in South America, looking over his shoulder, wondering when I'll decide to make his life difficult again." The detective studied his friend. "You could have destroyed them worse, called in favors from our military days, made them disappear entirely." Nathan sipped his wine thoughtfully. "Because living with their failures, watching me succeed while they rot, is far worse than anything else I could do to them." He gestured around the bustling restaurant. "Look at this place. Every night, people wait months for reservations. My restaurants are expanding nationally. Meanwhile, Thomas makes license plates, Regina organizes prison book clubs, and the others live in exile. And the new hires, the reformed convicts, everyone deserves a second chance." Nathan's smile carried no warmth. "As long as they understand the consequences of wasting it." Each new hire saw the news articles about Thomas and Regina. They understood exactly what happens to those who betray trust. Morrison shook his head admiringly. "You've turned even your revenge into a business advantage. The press loves the redemption narrative." "The best victories appear as mercies," Nathan replied. "Now, shall we discuss the information your forensic accountants found in Mark's overseas accounts?" The evening proceeded with quiet efficiency, like everything in Nathan's life now. His empire grew, his reputation soared, and his enemies served as constant reminders of the price of betrayal. 5 years passed like a well-executed business plan. Nathan stood at the edge of Lake Champlain. surveying the property that Regina had tried so desperately to claim. The house had been completely renovated, every trace of past events erased through careful reconstruction. His phone vibrated, a notification about Regina's early release for good behavior. The alert triggered a cascade of carefully prepared consequences. Across town, hotel computers mysteriously showed no vacancies. Credit card networks flagged her new accounts for review. Even her own family's numbers returned busy signals. Nathan accessed the security feeds, watching Regina exit the prison. Her designer clothes had been replaced by standard release attire, her confidence reduced to uncertain steps. She tried 3 hotels before giving up, each rejection captured by his surveillance network. "Sir," his house manager approached respectfully. "Detective Morrison is here." Nathan found his old friend in the lake house study, examining the view Regina had once tried to claim. "Getting sentimental in your retirement, James?" The former detective turned, grinning. "Hardly, just appreciating the sophistication of your revenge. Did you see Regina trying to check into the Holiday Inn?" "Of course," Nathan replied. The same security system recorded her attempts to contact her sister, her former clients, even her old charity boards. Nathan moved to his desk, activating multiple displays. No one wants to risk association with her. Thomas still has a decade to serve. Steve and Mark have vanished into exile. And you? Morrison accepted the offered whiskey. "Your restaurant chain goes national next month. There's talk of an IPO. Life progresses," Nathan agreed. "Though I do ensure our mutual friends remain aware of these developments. Regina receives press clippings about my success in her prison library. Thomas sees my restaurant commercials during TV time. Even Mark and Steve, hiding abroad, can't escape news of my expansion. The perfect punishment." Morrison raised his glass. "They live in obscurity while watching you thrive." "Not just watching," Nathan corrected. "Learning. Every former friend, every business associate, every potential partner sees what happens to those who mistake my civility for weakness." His phone buzzed again. Regina had resorted to seeking shelter at a homeless mission. The facility would mysteriously lose power shortly, forcing her back onto the streets. "Some might call this overkill," Morrison observed. "Some haven't experienced betrayal," Nathan replied. He accessed another security feed, showing Regina trudging along a rainy street, her release papers clutched to her chest. She chose this path the moment she crawled into those tents. Thomas chose it when he decided to steal from me. They all chose their fates. The lake house gleamed in the evening light. Its renovation was a testament to Nathan's success. Inside, staff prepared for another exclusive dinner party. Senators, business leaders, all eager to curry favor with the rising hospitality mogul. "Will you ever let them recover?" Morrison asked quietly. Nathan's laugh held no humor. "Recovery implies redemption. They don't deserve redemption. They deserve to serve as examples." He turned from the window. "Now shall we discuss the guest list for tonight? I believe several SEC commissioners are attending." The sun set over Lake Champlain as Nathan's guests began arriving. His empire continued growing, his influence expanding. Meanwhile, across town, Regina searched for shelter. Thomas counted days in his cell, and their former friends hid in distant countries. Nathan had learned in military intelligence that true victory wasn't just defeating your enemies. It was ensuring they lived to regret their choices. His revenge wasn't completed in the courthouse or the boardroom. It continued with every success he achieved, every comfort they lost, every day they spent knowing exactly who had orchestrated their destruction. He turned away from the lake, heading inside where his next triumph awaited. The past was settled. The future belonged to him. And anyone who witnessed Regina's fate, Thomas' imprisonment, or their friend's exile would understand the fundamental truth. Nathan Reed's memory was long, his revenge eternal, and his judgment absolute. Epilogue. 10 years after the verdicts, Nathan's empire had grown beyond restaurants into hotels, resorts, and luxury properties. The Reed Hospitality Group's stock price reflected its CEO's ruthless efficiency, each quarterly report reminding his enemies of what they'd lost. Regina worked as a waitress at a highway diner in Nevada, her designer clothes and social connections long forgotten. The name tag on her uniform read Rachel, an attempt to hide from her past that Nathan's surveillance network had noted within hours of her employment. "Order up," she called, her once confident voice now weary. The desert town offered anonymity, but even here, she couldn't escape Nathan's influence. Every credit application mysteriously failed. Job interviews at better establishments always ended in rejection. Her tips barely covered rent at a weekly rate motel. Her phone buzzed. Another blocked number. She'd stopped answering years ago, knowing it would be another recording of Nathan's latest business success, or Thomas's continued imprisonment. The messages arrived regularly, ensuring she never forgot the cost of betrayal. In a federal prison in Pennsylvania, Thomas Reed watched his brother's latest television interview. The prison common room fell silent as Nathan discussed his company's expansion plans. "That's your brother?" a new inmate asked, impressed by the business mogul on screen. "Was Thomas," he replied quietly, conscious of his faded prison uniform and graying hair. 7 years remained on his sentence, each day marked by reports of Nathan's growing success. His cell contained decades' worth of business magazines featuring his brother's rise, delivered monthly with mechanical precision. "Must be proud of him," the inmate continued. Thomas said nothing, remembering the last time he'd seen Nathan. In a courtroom 5 years ago, opposing his appeal for early release, his brother had sat silently in the gallery, while his legal team systematically destroyed every argument for clemency. Steve Martinez, once Nathan's trusted friend and business associate, lived in a small apartment in Buenos Aires. His days of corporate success had devolved into consulting work under an assumed name, always looking over his shoulder. Every potential client eventually discovered his past, their rejections often accompanied by mentions of Nathan Reed's concerns. Mark Davidson had chosen Bangkok for his exile, but distance provided no protection. His attempts to start new ventures inevitably crumbled when investors received anonymous dossiers detailing his history. He spent his days in cheap bars, telling anyone who would listen about his former life as a successful American businessman. Detective James Morrison, now retired from the force, served on the Reed Hospitality Group's board of directors. His law enforcement connections had proven valuable in maintaining Nathan's security network, ensuring his former friends remained under constant observation. Regina tried applying for a manager position at a Sacramento restaurant. Morrison reported during their monthly dinner at Nathan's flagship establishment. The owner received an interesting file about her history an hour later. Nathan nodded, reviewing projected revenue figures on his tablet. "And Thomas' latest appeal?" "Denied this morning," Morrison replied. Judge cited the overwhelming evidence and ongoing concerns about financial restitution. "Excellent." Nathan set aside the tablet. "How's the investigation into Mark's attempt to open that tourism company in Thailand?" "Already shut down." Local authorities were very interested in his history of financial fraud. "He's back to living off what's left of his hidden accounts." The restaurant hummed with exclusive clientele, each table representing millions in net worth and immeasurable social influence. Nathan's empire had become a symbol of success, his story of overcoming betrayal adding an irresistible narrative to his business acumen. "Sir," his assistant approached discreetly. "Governor Williams asked about hosting his fundraiser here next month." "Send him the premium package details," Nathan replied. "And make sure he knows about our special security arrangements." The assistant nodded, understanding the implication. Nathan's venues had become known for their absolute privacy and discretion, a reputation built on his expertise in both gathering and protecting sensitive information. Later that evening, Nathan reviewed the latest surveillance reports in his penthouse office. Regina's failed job application, Thomas' denied appeal, Steve's struggling consultancy, Mark's collapsed venture. Each piece meticulously documented, each failure carefully orchestrated. His phone buzzed, a message from the Lake Champlain property manager. The renovation was complete, erasing the last physical traces of that fateful camping trip. The lake house had become an exclusive retreat, its guest list carefully curated to exclude anyone connected to his former life. Mr. Reed, his security chief, entered with a tablet. "We've detected unusual activity. Regina's trying to write a book about her experiences." Nathan smiled. "Contact our friends in publishing. Remind them about the legal implications of profiting from criminal activities, and send Regina the transcript of her trial testimony. The parts about fraud and perjury should be highlighted." The chief nodded, already composing messages. Nathan's network of influence had grown far beyond his military intelligence days, encompassing business leaders, politicians, and power brokers across continents. A notification appeared on his screen. "Thomas has attempted to contact Regina through a third party. The prison will soon receive evidence of unauthorized communication, ensuring his privileges are restricted." Every attempt to rebuild connections between the conspirators met swift, silent resistance. Nathan opened his private elevator to the helipad, where his pilot waited to fly him to a board meeting in Boston. Below, the city sparkled, each light representing potential opportunities and threats to be managed. His empire had become a testament to the power of patient revenge. Each success, another twist of the knife in his enemy's wounds. Detective Morrison suggested, "We should ease up on Regina." His assistant mentioned during the flight, 10 years of punishment might be enough. "Interesting perspective," Nathan replied, not looking up from his documents. "Remind me to show him the surveillance photos from last month. The ones showing her meeting with a literary agent. Apparently, a decade of consequences hasn't fully conveyed the message." The helicopter descended toward Boston's financial district, where Nathan's latest acquisition waited. The target company had once rejected his expansion plans, siding with Steve's recommendations. Their CEO would soon learn the cost of that decision. In Nevada, Regina served coffee to truckers, her hands shaking slightly as she watched Nathan's face appear on the diner's television. In Bangkok, Mark drank cheap whiskey, avoiding eye contact with other expatriates who might recognize him. In Buenos Aires, Steve deleted another rejection email, the sender apologetically mentioning Nathan Reed's concerns. The message remained consistent. Betrayal carried an eternal price. Nathan's victims served as living mournings. They were suffering a testament to the consequences of underestimating a man who'd learned revenge in the service of his country. His empire grew, his influence expanded, and his enemies endured their carefully crafted punishments. The world saw a successful businessman who had overcome betrayal. Only a select few understood the true scope of his vengeance, a revenge served not cold, but with the patient precision of a man who'd made destruction an art form. In his Boston office, Nathan reviewed the latest reports of his former friends, suffering with the same attention he gave to quarterly earnings. Each failure, each setback, each moment of despair had been planned years in advance, a symphony of revenge conducted with military precision. The sun set on another successful day in the life of Nathan Reed. While across the world, those who had betrayed him faced another night of consequences. Their punishment would never end, not because Nathan couldn't forgive, but because he'd decided they would serve as eternal examples of the price of betrayal. Their story became a whispered warning in business circles and social gatherings. Cross Nathan Reed and spend the rest of your life regretting it. His success wasn't just measured in dollars and properties, but in the sustained suffering of those who had wronged him. The empire grew, the surveillance continued, and the message remained clear. Nathan Reed never forgot, never forgave, and never stopped reminding his enemies of their fatal mistake. In boardrooms and prison cells, in desert diners and foreign bars, the lesson echoed. Betrayal's price was eternal, and Nathan Reed always collected his debts. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.